Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Fred and George Weasley are among the most vibrant and unforgettable characters in the Harry Potter series. Their cheerful nature, boldness, and wit made them fan favorites. But like any complex characters, the twins have their darker sides. Today we'll take a closer look at some less obvious but quite troubling aspects of Fred and George's behavior. Number 1, their jokes sometimes bordered on cruelty. Yes, they were Hogwarts' ultimate pranksters, but not all their antics could be considered harmless. More often than not, their pranks caused emotional, and sometimes even physical, discomfort. And their favorite targets? Slytherin students, and sadly, their own siblings. Remember when they booed a first year just for being sorted into Slytherin? Or the time they terrified Ron with a fake spider, planting a deep-rooted fear that stayed with him for life. Number 2, a lack of empathy. Fred and George were masters at lightening the mood, but often did so at the expense of someone's feelings. Their pursuit of laughter often clashed with compassion and understanding. They rarely stopped to think about how their jokes were received. Even when the prank wasn't meant to be cruel, it could still hurt someone, and unfortunately, the twins almost never considered the consequences. Number 3, their shop raises ethical concerns. No doubt Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was a brilliant creation, but some of their products raise serious moral questions, especially the love potions. These potions are dangerous. They override a person's free will and have led to risky situations. Harry, for instance, had to constantly stay alert to avoid becoming a victim of these seemingly harmless products. The fact that Fred and George sold them at all calls into question their sense of responsibility. Number 4, a total disregard for rules. The twins broke nearly every rule in the Hogwarts handbook, yet they seemed to get away with it, perhaps thanks to their Quidditch fame and natural charm. The school staff didn't appear particularly interested in reining them in. The only professor who tried was Dolores Umbridge, and while her methods were highly controversial, she was the only one who even attempted to put a stop to their chaos. Number 5, a dark edge to their humor. In many scenes, it feels like Fred and George genuinely enjoy making others uncomfortable. It wasn't just about getting laughs. It was about seeing people squirm or blush. When Hermione politely tried to point out that some of their pranks went too far, they mocked her, saying she just didn't have a sense of humor. In truth, she was simply standing up for basic dignity. Number 6, humor isn't for everyone. There's no denying that the twins added fun and lightness to the story, but humor is subjective. Not every reader or viewer enjoyed their antics. Some fans have said their jokes felt forced, crude, or just plain unfunny, especially when it came to pranks made at someone else's expense. Number 7, they weren't always good brothers. Ron, as the youngest Weasley boy, desperately needed support and validation. Sadly, Fred and George often did more harm than good. They were responsible for his arachnophobia. They once played a prank that left his tongue swollen. They constantly mocked his insecurities. And when it came time to hand over the Marauders map, they gave it to Harry instead of Ron, as if Ron wasn't trustworthy enough. Their sister Ginny didn't get much support either. Yes, they loved her, but real brotherly care in tough moments, especially during her ordeal in second year, was almost non-existent. Number 8, they are careless with others' safety. Fred and George loved danger, the flash, the bang, the roar of laughter after. Their jokes weren't harmless. They were fireworks with teeth, magic loaded into wrappers, trouble waiting to happen. During their big fireworks stunt, a serpent rocket slammed into a corridor wall. It exploded. Flames burst across the stone. Curtains smoked. A second-year girl screamed. Her robes were scorched. "Relax, it's under control," Fred shouted, but it wasn't. McGonagall stormed in, eyes blazing. "Are you mad?" she hissed. George only smirked. "Bit of heat adds drama." Their stink bombs caused chaos in the dungeons. Slime oozed across the floor. 2 students fell, hard. A cauldron tipped. Boiling potion splashed on a Slytherin's arm. He screamed, skin blistering. Snape appeared, livid. "You call this a prank?" Fred didn't speak. George looked away. They tested products on classmates, without warning. One boy ate a canary cream, laughed, then screamed. Feathers everywhere. Beak stuck. For an hour he was half-bird. He cried in the bathroom. "I just wanted to miss class," he sobbed. No one came to check on him, especially not the twins. Number 9, they showed disrespect for authority. Fred and George didn't just break the rules, they laughed in their faces, tore them up, set them on fire. To them, rules weren't limits, they were invitations. And authority, just something to mock. Their defiance didn't begin with Umbridge. It started long before. Detentions meant nothing. Howlers were background music. Even McGonagall, stern, fair, quietly fond of them, couldn't hold them back. "You need to take school seriously," she told them once. Fred grinned. "We take fun seriously." Then vanished with George and a bag of enchanted fireworks. She caught them more than once. In the act, hexing staircases, swapping potions. "This is a direct violation of school policy," she snapped. George raised a brow. "Then the policy clearly lacks imagination." They weren't trying to make a point. They just wanted the rush, the joke, the moment. Later, when Umbridge came, their defiance looked heroic. Fireworks, chaos, glory. But they'd been pushing back against all authority, good and bad, for years. They didn't fight tyranny, they fought control. Any control, every command became a punchline. Number 10, they don't think about consequences. Fred and George never waited, never planned. If it sounded fun, they did it. If it sparkled, exploded, or made someone fall over, perfect. They didn't ask questions, especially not what happens next. Once, they poured a potion near the Slytherin entrance. The floor turned to soap. Chaos followed. Students slipped, screamed, slammed into walls. One boy broke his wrist. Snape stormed into the Great Hall. "This is sabotage!" he bellowed. Fred raised an eyebrow. "We prefer creative chemistry." The boy lay in the hospital wing, his wand arm in a sling. Still no apology. Their fireworks, a masterpiece. Dragons, comets, bangs, magic tearing through the air. Everyone cheered, until one rocket flew straight at Flitwick. He ducked, barely. "That could have killed me," he squeaked. George shrugged. Dramatic effect. They called it a success. No one counted the scorch marks on the tapestries. And then the big exit, the legendary escape. They soared out of Hogwarts on brooms, laughing through fire and smoke. "Give a hell from us, Peeves!" Fred shouted. It looked like freedom, like power, but it was also a gamble. No exams, no backup, just a shop and a pocket full of luck. Kids watched and followed. "Why study?" they whispered. Fred and George didn't. But not everyone gets a joke shot. Not everyone lands on their feet. The twins never thought of that, never saw the copies, the kids who crashed trying to fly the same path. They weren't cruel, just careless. But in magic, carelessness is dangerous. It spreads faster than fire, louder than laughter, and sometimes the ones left to clean up aren't the ones who lit the spark. Number 11, they abused their magical talents. Fred and George were gifted, scary smart. Their spells worked the first time. Their potions fizzed perfectly. They weren't just students, they were inventors, but instead of building something good, they built chaos and sold it with a grin. Their skiving snack boxes looked like candy, but they made kids collapse, puke, faint, nosebleeds on command. One Hufflepuff girl passed out cold in herbology. Her friend screamed, "She's not breathing!" Pomfrey came running. She found the wrapper. "Fainting fancy," it said. Fred shrugged. Bit strong, that batch. He didn't look sorry. The fireworks stunt in the Great Hall, pure madness. Dragons exploded mid-air, rockets flew past faces. One spell clipped a Ravenclaw's arm. His robe caught fire. He screamed. George laughed. "Hot stuff!" McGonagall didn't. "You could have killed someone," she barked. But the twins had already disappeared in a puff of glittering smoke. They cursed toilets to scream, enchanted staircases to grab ankles, laid down prank hexes that lasted for days. A first year once tripped, twisted her knee, and sobbed in the corridor. Fred peeked around the corner. "Oops," he said. George winced. "Still working out the bugs?" Then they walked away. It wasn't just mischief, it was power, used without care. And that's the problem. They could have done anything, created something good, changed lives. Instead, they sold nosebleeds in shiny wrappers, called it business, called it fun. Magic is serious, dangerous, it can heal or harm. Fred and George never saw the line, or maybe they did, and just stepped over it anyway, because the laugh always mattered more. Number 12. They don't respect other people's efforts. Fred and George hated seriousness. If you tried too hard, they laughed. If you followed rules, they rolled their eyes. To them, effort was something to mock, unless it was their own. Percy worked like mad, neat scrolls, long hours, big dreams. He wanted the ministry, respect, order. But Fred and George turned every success into a joke. "Minister of Magic coming through!" Fred would yell, saluting. George followed with, "Careful, don't step on his sense of self-importance." Percy's ears turned red, but he never fought back, just walked away a little smaller each time. Hermione had her cause, SPW, house elf rights, posters, pins, research. She poured her soul into it, but the twins turned it into a circus. They made socks dance on the table. "Freedom for footwear!" George shouted. Fred added, "They're unionizing." Laughter erupted. Hermione didn't laugh. "You're making fun of something that matters," she said, voice tight. They shrugged. "It's just a joke." Ron felt it too. He practiced spells for days. One night he nailed the summoning charm. The feather flew. Harry cheered. Hermione clapped. Fred leaned back. "Whoa, Ronnikins is turning into Percy," he said with a smirk. Ron's grin vanished. He dropped his wand. "Yeah, maybe." The twins didn't think they were hurting anyone, but they were. Again and again, with every jab, every sneer. They thought they were clever, sharp, funny, but sometimes all they did was break people's pride. Not everyone wants to be the loudest. Some just want to be seen, to be taken seriously. Fred and George never gave them that. If it didn't make them laugh, it didn't matter, and they never stayed long enough to see the damage they left behind. Number 13, they're bad role models. Fred and George were legends. To the younger kids, they were everything, cool, fearless, wild. They didn't care about grades or rules or what anyone thought. They lit up every room and set a few on fire. But being fun isn't the same as being right. Colin Creevey tried to be like them. He charmed his camera to squirt ink at people. Thought it was hilarious. It wasn't. A Hufflepuff girl ended up screaming, eyes burning. Madame Pomfrey was furious. Colin stood there, shaking. "Fred and George would have laughed," he whispered. But no one else did. The twins mocked classes constantly. "OWLs," Fred scoffed once. "Only worthless letters." George juggled dung bombs in the common room. "We study chaos." Everyone laughed, except Hermione. "You're ruining things for people who care," she snapped. "You're not helping. You're just loud." They didn't listen. They never did. They hated authority, always did. Snape, Filch, Umbridge, fair game. But it wasn't just bullies they went after. They once stole Filch's entire key ring, gave it to Peeves, locked half the school inside classrooms. "Security's for cowards," George said. Fred added, "We're liberating Hogwarts." But Filch stood in the corridor, silent, humiliated. No apology came. Ron tried copying them, snuck out one night, set off a spell in the kitchens, got detention and a sprained ankle. Brilliant, huh? He muttered later. But there was no joy in his voice. Ginny tried too, tried a prank that nearly blew up a hallway. The wall cracked, the floor scorched. Molly didn't yell, she just looked tired. "I can't lose all of you," she whispered. Fred and George had charm, had guts, had spark. But that's not enough, not when kids follow you, not when your shadow teaches others how to act. They weren't evil, but they weren't heroes either. Because real heroes know when to stop. And Fred and George never did. Number 14. They are selfish toward their parents. Fred and George Weasley never waited for permission, not from teachers, not from rules, not even from their parents. Molly and Arthur gave them love, warmth, a roof, despite having almost nothing. But the twins acted like it wasn't enough. They mocked Percy every chance they got. "I say, Father," Fred would sneer, pretending to adjust invisible glasses, "we must uphold the dignity of the ministry." George would add, "Splendid tie, Percy. Did it come with a promotion?" Percy went red. Molly sighed. She was proud of Percy. He was her straight line in a house full of chaos. The twins didn't care. Then they dropped out of Hogwarts, not quietly, not responsibly. No letter home, no serious talk, just chaos, brooms, fireworks, laughter. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred shouted, flying off like it was a game. Molly stared at the paper the next day, pale and shaking. "They left," she whispered, "just like that." She had begged them to finish school. "Please," she said one night, voice cracking, "take your NEWTs." George shrugged. "We'll be fine, Mum." Fred grinned. "We've got a better plan." But they didn't tell her. Not then, not until they were gone. When she found out about the shop, she didn't smile. She stared at the sign in the window. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Bright, loud, reckless. "A joke shop," she said. "That's what you left for." Fred beamed. "It's brilliant, isn't it?" But her heart wasn't ready to see brilliance. Only risk. She didn't sleep for days. What if it failed? What if someone got hurt? What if she lost them for good? She had watched them fly out of her life without looking back, not thinking what it cost her, not asking if she was ready to let go. Number 15. They disregard personal boundaries. Fred and George Weasley loved breaking rules, not just school rules, any rules, especially the invisible ones, like personal space or privacy. To them, everything was fair game. If it got a laugh, it was worth it. One day, they took Ron's owl without asking. Just grabbed Pigwidgeon and sent out prank letters. "That's my owl!" Ron yelled, his voice cracking. "You can't do that." Fred only winked. "Lighten up, Ronnikins." But those letters were from Hermione, private, serious, not a joke. Ron didn't find it funny. Not this time. Then there was the Christmas stunt. The twins charged into the girls' dorms wearing enchanted Santa hats. Alicia screamed. Angelina hit Fred with a broom. "Get out!" she roared. George bowed. "Merry Christmas," he said, like that made it okay. But it didn't. Not when girls locked their doors tighter after that night. Hermione was always their favorite target. Her spew campaign, constantly mocked. "Free the socks!" Fred would shout, throwing laundry around the common room. George would add, "You'll unionize the teapots next." Hermione's eyes would blaze. "You think this is funny?" she said once. "You're laughing at suffering." George shrugged. "You just don't have a sense of humor." But she did, just not for Cruelty. Neville got it too, poor Neville. One morning he found Trevor, his toad, dyed neon pink. Everyone laughed. Fred raised his hands. "Artistic expression." Neville didn't smile. "He's my toad," he said softly. "You didn't ask." But Fred and George had already run off. On to the next laugh. People let them get away with it. because they were charming, because they were funny, because everyone wanted to be on their good side. But jokes stop being jokes when only the joker is laughing. There's a line. The twins didn't just cross it, they danced on it. Number 16, they can't take criticism. It all began in the middle of a conversation in the Gryffindor common room. The air was thick with the familiar scent of wood smoke and aged parchment, and the crackling fire painted warm shadows on the walls. Hermione Granger, her brow furrowed in concern, sat stiffly on the edge of a red velvet armchair facing the Weasley twins, who lounged lazily on the rug like a pair of smug lions. The moment had been building for weeks, ever since Fred and George had opened their joke shop venture, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, in a small, cluttered corner of the Burrow's attic before eventually expanding their operation to Diagon Alley. Hermione had tolerated the pranks, the laughter, the minor chaos, but the day she found a second-year vomiting slugs after trying one of their experimental sweets, she decided it was time for a serious word. Some of your products, she began cautiously, are clearly not safe. I don't mean to sound harsh, but there's a line between fun and irresponsibility. Fred's eyes glinted with mischief. Hermione, he said dramatically, placing a hand on his heart. Such little faith in us. George chimed in with a grin. You wound us, truly. We've only maimed a few students so far. Yeah, progress, wouldn't you say? Their words sparked laughter from nearby Gryffindors, but Hermione didn't laugh. She stood her ground, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. You can joke all you like, but someone could be seriously hurt. You're not children anymore. People trust you with these things. That was the first crack in the mask. Fred's smile twitched, too sharp. George's brow lifted in mock indignation. Are you suggesting we don't know what we're doing? Fred asked, a playful tone barely masking the edge beneath. I'm saying you might want to take your own creations more seriously, Hermione replied. You have a responsibility now. But the twins didn't do serious, not when it concerned their work. Their charm, their armor, had always been laughter, deflection, and a healthy dose of sarcasm. They could cut down any opponent with a joke, disarm an angry professor with a wink. They'd built an identity around being untouchable, cheeky, untamed, and criticism, especially criticism that poked holes in that identity, was their blind spot. When Professor McGonagall had once questioned the potential hazard of their skiving snack boxes, Fred had given her a dramatic bow and said, If you're not willing to risk a nosebleed, are you really living? George added, We find a little blood adds authenticity. The class had laughed, but McGonagall had not, and neither had Hermione. They believed they could spin anything with a joke. And perhaps they could, to most people. But Hermione knew better. She knew that when sarcasm sharpened, when the smiles grew forced, it was because the truth was cutting too close. Fred and George Weasley were not immune to criticism. They just refused to admit it. Their refusal was not about ego, not entirely. It was a fear of vulnerability, of being seen not as the carefree tricksters, but as fallible, flawed young men. They were not ready to accept that their actions could have real-world consequences. To do so would mean stepping into adulthood, and for all their brilliance, the twins clung to the illusion of invincibility like a lifeline. When Ron once mentioned that their Tun-Tung toffee had almost gotten them expelled after Dudley's tongue had swollen to the size of a python, Fred had laughed and said he needed the exercise. But even then, behind the joke, there had been a flicker of tension. Molly Weasley had screamed herself hoarse that day, her face pale with fury, not just at the prank, but at their refusal to take it seriously. You don't listen, she'd said. You laugh it off always. You think life is one big joke, but you won't laugh when someone ends up in St. Mungo's. Fred had muttered something under his breath, and George had stared at the wall. They didn't respond with words. but their silence had said enough. Even Dumbledore had once offered them advice in the calm, wise tone that always carried more weight than shouting. "Humour," he said, "is a gift, but when used to shield oneself from truth, it becomes a cage." But they never spoke of that moment again. It vanished, like so many truths they didn't want to face. During the events of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, their rebellious acts became even bolder. They transformed their school into a minefield of laughter and chaos, detonating fireworks, turning corridors into swamps, mocking Dolores Umbridge to her face. The students cheered. They were heroes. But underneath it all, Hermione watched with unease. "Fred, George," she said one evening, "this isn't just mischief anymore. You're waging war. What if it backfires?" Fred only smiled. "All the best plans do." "You're being reckless," Hermione pressed. George gave her a pointed look. "And you're being dull." It was a cruel cut, and it stung, but more importantly, it showed their refusal to hear her concern, not because she was wrong, but because they couldn't stand the idea of being wrong. Their reaction to criticism was always the same: dismiss, deflect, deride. They'd mastered the art of emotional dodgeball. But Hermione, ever persistent, wouldn't give up. She brought them studies on magical side effects. She cited accidents caused by amateur potion mixing. She even offered to help them research safer alternatives. But instead of listening, they scoffed. "You should join the Department of Magical Killjoys," Fred joked. "Honestly, Hermione," George added, "you're one step away from wearing a ministry badge." Her voice cracked with frustration. "I'm trying to help you." But they couldn't hear that, not through the armor of humor they wore like second skin. To admit she was right would mean facing the uncomfortable truth that fun had limits, that mischief could hurt, that even jesters had to grow up someday. Later, when their business truly began to flourish in Diagon Alley, Hermione visited their shop. It was magnificent, an explosion of colors and sound, packed with students, laughter, and wonder. She was amazed. But in a quiet corner, she noticed a display labeled test products. "Use at your own risk," she frowned. "Number 17, they lack gratitude." Fred and George Weasley were never known for following the rules. Mischief was their language, laughter their armor. But beneath the fireworks, the pranks, and the grins that lit up even the darkest corners of the burrow, there was something missing, something subtle, yet deeply human. Gratitude. It wasn't about polite thank yous over breakfast. It wasn't about scripted holiday cards or public displays of appreciation. It was about something far more intimate, the silent recognition of love received, of sacrifices made. And when it came to this, Fred and George often seemed to fall short, especially toward the people who loved them most. Arthur Weasley worked endless hours in a modest ministry job that barely paid enough to feed 7 children. Molly Weasley stretched every sickle to its last inch, knitting sweaters, cooking vast meals, and keeping the home alive with warmth. Ron, Percy, Bill, Charlie, and Ginny all understood, in their own way, how much had been given to them. Even Ron, in his jealous moments, never forgot where he came from. But Fred and George, with their boundless energy and dazzling charisma, often acted as though the world owed them a stage and an audience. They were the wild cards of the family, the ones who never seemed constrained by the weight of reality. While Ron wore second-hand robes and looked down at his shoes in embarrassment, Fred and George laughed it off and turned poverty into a punchline. "We're identical," Fred once joked to Harry. "But at least Mum didn't try to sew our initials into our socks this year." Small victories. Their humor was a shield, but also a veil, one that sometimes hid the truth that they rarely acknowledged the struggle that kept the roof over their heads. Take their departure from Hogwarts, for example. A brilliant, explosive moment of rebellion. The fireworks, the swamp in the hallway, the cries of delight from the younger students. It was iconic. But what most forget is that Molly cried that night, not because she didn't support her son's dreams, but because they left without telling her, without explaining, without so much as a note. It wasn't just about the school. It was about leaving home, leaving behind her protection, her years of silent support, with nothing but a bang and a broomstick. When they opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, it was a triumph. Yes, but it wasn't just theirs. Harry Potter, barely 17 and traumatized by war, gave them the seed money, 1,000 galleons, enough to change their lives. Use it to buy some new robes, he joked, trying to lighten the moment. But it wasn't a joke. It was everything he had from the Tri-Wizard tournament. Fred and George took it, with a grin, a wink, and maybe a quip, but never with real words. Not the kind that linger, not a quiet, heartfelt thank you whispered when no one was looking. Even years later, when the shop became a success, there was no letter, no owl, no moment where George and Fred, before the war took him, sat with Harry and said, "You believed in us before anyone else did." Harry never asked for it. Of course not. But that's the thing about gratitude. It isn't owed, but it is noticed when it's absent. The war changed many things, but for Fred and George, the loss of Fred was a thunderclap. Maybe it was only then that George began to see everything in a different light. In the silence that followed Fred's death, there was space for reflection. Maybe he remembered the long nights Arthur spent fixing broken toys with Muggle glue and magic, or the way Molly stayed up waiting for them after every Quidditch match, even the ones they snuck out to attend. There's no passage in the books where George falls to his knees and thanks his parents, or Harry, or Ron. J.K. Rowling didn't write that scene, but there are moments where you can almost feel the guilt between the lines. After the Battle of Hogwarts, when George stands beside his fallen twin, perhaps he thinks of everything they never said, to each other, to their family, to the boy who gave them a future. Ron, despite being overshadowed for much of his youth, never let bitterness fully consume him. When he helped in the joke shop after the war, it wasn't for profit, it was for George, and still the dynamic never shifted. Fred and George were beloved. But that love wasn't always reciprocal in the way it should have been. They loved in laughter, in risk, in grand gestures, but in the quiet spaces, those sacred pockets where words matter most, they were often absent. Mrs. Weasley's greatest gift was love without limits. She defended her children like a lioness, even when they frustrated her. "Not my daughter, you bitch," she screamed in the great hall. But it wasn't just Ginny she was protecting, it was the very soul of her family. And yet how often did Fred or George sit with her in the kitchen and just thank her for the socks, the soup, the sleepless nights, for the lullabies and lectures and the love she wrapped around them like a second skin. There's a scene in Order of the Phoenix where Molly argues with Sirius about the children being involved in the war. Her worry is palpable. "He's not your son," she says fiercely. But she doesn't say it about Ron, she says it about Harry, because in her eyes, Harry is one of hers. And that includes loving his friends, Fred and George, as if they were her own. But they never quite reflected that depth of emotion back toward her. Not with words. Not in the ways that last. Number 18, they ignore the morality of their inventions. In the bustling heart of Diagon Alley, nestled between more traditional wizarding shops, stands a place that bursts with colour, sound and laughter. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. It's a place where jokes are sold in jars and enchantments come wrapped in bright packages. But behind the glittering storefront of Fred and George Weasley's joke shop lies a deeper, more unsettling truth. While the wizarding world sees them as harmless pranksters, two red-headed rebels who brought light to dark times, their inventions often flirt with ethical boundaries that no one seems to question. Take, for instance, their skiving snack boxes. On the surface, these are brilliant creations, sweets that cause sudden and convincing illnesses like nosebleeds, fainting spells, or uncontrollable vomiting, only to be instantly cured by the antidote hidden in the second half of the treat. They were a roaring success among Hogwarts students, allowing them to skip classes at will. But isn't there something inherently troubling about a tool that manipulates health, real or fake, for personal gain? "They're brilliant, George," Fred said in Order of the Phoenix, "but we need to work on the puking pastilles. They don't last long enough." That line, intended as humor, barely masks the deeper issue. The normalization of using illness, even a simulated one, as a means to escape responsibility. The ethical concern grows darker when you consider that these weren't mere pranks. They were marketed to children. Teenagers in Hogwarts could use them to avoid exams, obligations, or even just a boring class. But what if someone used them to escape punishment, to frame someone else for making them sick? The Weasley twins never included any moral guidance in their sales. There were no warnings, no fine print, just magic disguised as fun. And therein lies the problem. In their quest for innovation and mischief, Fred and George abandoned all moral responsibility. One cannot discuss the moral ambiguity of their products without mentioning Peruvian instant darkness powder. As its name suggests, it creates an impenetrable cloud of darkness when released, a useful tool in dangerous hands. Draco Malfoy used it in Half-Blood Prince to escape detection, while executing his mission to bring Death Eaters into Hogwarts. He whipped out his wand and threw down something that exploded with a bang and a cloud of thick, black smoke. The twins sold this powder during wartime, knowing full well that the line between joke and weapon was growing thinner every day. Did they pause to wonder what would happen if this product landed in the hands of a Death Eater? There's no evidence they did. Then there are the decoy detonators, small black devices that scurry off, explode with a loud bang, and serve as a distraction. Ingenious? Absolutely. Harmless? Not remotely. These were eventually used by the Order of the Phoenix and the trio themselves during the Ministry infiltration. But the question remains, should joke shop owners be mass-producing tactical distraction devices during a wizarding war? That's no longer mischief, that's warfare. And Fred and George, whether knowingly or not, became arms dealers for both children and adults. Let's not forget their line of love potions. Love potions, in the wizarding world, carry dangerous implications. "They really do work, then?" asked Romilda Vane in Half-Blood Prince, to which Fred replies with a wink, "Oh yes." But love potions aren't jokes, they're instruments of manipulation. In the Muggle world, we'd call it a violation of consent. A girl slipping one to a boy, or vice versa, isn't romantic, it's coercive. Yet Fred and George place them on brightly coloured shelves with cute names and heart-shaped bottles, ignoring the dark undercurrent of what they were really selling. Even Ron Weasley ended up under the influence of one, nearly dying from the poison that came with a misdirected attempt. And who could forget the Tun-Tung Toffee incident? Dudley Dursley was the unfortunate victim when Fred and George dropped the toffee accidentally during their visit to Privet Drive. Dudley eagerly snatched it, and within seconds his tongue swelled to 4 feet long. "It was a very poor joke," Mrs. Weasley scolded them in Goblet of Fire, clearly alarmed by the incident. But for the twins, it was worth it. They didn't ask permission. They didn't warn anyone. They used a real child as an unwitting test subject for their product. That's not just mischievous, it's cruel. Even their fainting fancies pose an ethical dilemma. Imagine if a student uses one to fake unconsciousness during an emergency drill at Hogwarts, or worse, during an actual attack. In a world where danger was not only real but ever-present, selling such an item without guidelines or warnings was reckless. The twins trusted that their customers would use these tools responsibly, but children and teenagers are not known for their foresight. If a product can be misused, it will be. And Fred and George, clever as they were, refused to face that reality. One of their lesser-known items, the nosebleed nougat, caused profuse bleeding from the nostrils, convincing enough to terrify a teacher into letting a student leave class. In Order of the Phoenix, students were lining up to buy them, but nosebleeds, even magical ones, carry risk. What if the student had a blood condition? What if they reacted badly to the magic? The Weasley twins, in their pursuit of success and laughter, didn't seem to care. The moral evaluation was always missing. It's worth remembering that Fred and George didn't complete their Hogwarts education. They left in a blaze of fireworks and rebellion, a moment celebrated by students tired of Dolores Umbridge's tyranny. But their premature departure also meant they never learned the deeper consequences of magical misuse. Education is not just about spells, it's about wisdom, ethics, control. Without that, a clever wizard becomes a dangerous one. And while their intentions might not have been malicious, negligence can be just as damaging as malice. The truth is, the Weasley twins operated in a moral vacuum. Their inventions were often brilliant, but brilliance without conscience can lead to disaster. They never considered creating guidelines for their products, never issued magical waivers or safety spells. They sold illusions, manipulations, distractions, and deceptions to anyone with enough galleons to pay. And when chaos ensued, they simply laughed. Number 19. They don't develop as characters. Fred and George Weasley explode into the story of Harry Potter like twin firecrackers. From their first appearance in the Sorcerer's Stone, they are bold, brash, and brilliant in their own way. Their signature entrance, teasing their younger brother Ron, impersonating each other, and charming even the usually sharp-tongued Mrs. Weasley, sets the tone for the roles they will occupy for the rest of the series. They are the jesters, the comic relief, the agents of chaos in an often grim world. And yet, as the series grows darker, more complex, and layered with grief, death, and moral ambiguity, the twins remain remarkably unchanged. This is not just noticeable, it's unsettling. In a world where even Draco Malfoy is allowed to evolve, to wrestle with his choices, Fred and George are frozen in time. Throughout the 7 books, characters undergo transformations that reflect the trauma and weight of the war against Voldemort. Neville Longbottom, once forgetful and insecure, becomes a leader of the resistance in Hogwarts. Luna Lovegood, eccentric and detached, becomes a deeply empathetic, loyal friend. Even Percy Weasley, the pompous older brother, realizes the cost of blind loyalty to the Ministry and returns to fight alongside his family. Fred and George, they open a joke shop. Their business, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, is indeed an impressive venture. Their inventions are clever, their marketing is ingenious, and their shop becomes a symbol of hope and rebellion in a world overshadowed by tyranny. But it is not character development, it is career development. Their essence, their cheeky humor, disregard for authority and penchant for chaos remains untouched by the war, the loss, or the growing tension in the wizarding world. Even in Order of the Phoenix, when they spectacularly drop out of Hogwarts, fireworks blazing, leaving Umbridge coughing in a haze of magical smoke, they are not maturing, they are escalating. Compare this to Ron Weasley, their own brother, who spends the series navigating insecurity, jealousy, fear of inadequacy, and finally learning to value himself. In the Deathly Hallows, Ron temporarily leaves Harry and Hermione overwhelmed by pressure, fear, and the burden of the Horcrux. His return, filled with remorse and courage, marks a critical moment of personal growth. Fred and George, meanwhile, continue making jokes, crafting skiving snack boxes, and dodging death with a wink. The closest we come to seeing a flicker of emotional depth is when George loses his ear during the Battle of the Seven Potters. His blood is spilled, he's physically altered forever. "Saint-like," Fred quips when George jokes that the hole in his head makes him holy. The moment is undercut by humour so quickly that the trauma barely lands. There is no exploration of George's pain, no indication of how this might change his perspective. Fred's death later in the story is a seismic tragedy, and yet because their characters were never built for depth, it lands with a certain shallowness. The reader mourns the role Fred played, not the journey he had. There's something heartbreaking in how static they are. These are characters we meet when they're only 13 and who stay with us all the way through the final battle. We watch Harry lose innocence, Hermione gain wisdom, Ginny discover confidence, and even Dudley Dursley come to terms with his past. But Fred and George, they don't seem to carry the weight of the war in their bones. They don't have a moment where they sit quietly, reckoning with what's happening to the world they love. They are agents of laughter, even in a dying world. In Goblet of Fire, when the twins try to enter the Triwizard Tournament underage and end up thrown back by Dumbledore's enchantments, they immediately start laughing. "You know what?" Fred said. "I reckon we're almost there." It's a great moment of levity, but by the end of the series, when students are being tortured in classrooms and Muggleborns are hunted, the same kind of humour feels out of place. The twins never adapt to the new tone. They persist in being pranksters, even as the castle around them burns. In Half-Blood Prince, when the world is unravelling, when Katie Bell is cursed, Dumbledore is dying, and fear has spread to every corridor, we still see the twins running their shop, sending products to Hogwarts and making jokes about Umbridge. George even says, "Can't say fairer than that," when talking about getting revenge on the Ministry. It's like they are watching the war from a safe balcony, tossing fireworks down at the chaos below. They resist change not because they're immune to it, but because the story refuses to let them evolve. The emotional complexity of other characters only deepens the contrast. In Deathly Hallows, Draco Malfoy becomes a compelling example of forced maturity. Once a petty school bully, Draco is dragged into the heart of Voldemort's inner circle. His fear is palpable, his hesitation evident. When he lowers his wand in the astronomy tower, when he hesitates to identify Harry at Malfoy Manor, these are moments of inner conflict. Fred and George never have such moments. They remain certain of themselves, untouched by doubt. This lack of internal evolution is particularly strange given the twins' intelligence. They are not simple-minded characters. Their mastery of magical invention, their ability to outsmart Umbridge and Filch, and their economic success all speak to cunning and brilliance, but their emotional lives are one-dimensional. We never see them grieve, question, fear, or falter. Even when Percy distances himself from the family, a deeply painful rift, the twins respond with derision rather than heartbreak. Fred jokes about Percy's loyalty to the Ministry. There's no real pain expressed, no yearning for reconciliation. In the final book, as the war draws near, George's ear is blown off by a curse. "I'm holy, Fred, get it?" he says. And Fred laughs. It's a moment so jarring, so unwilling to sit in pain, that it feels almost defiant. In the face of suffering, they choose the joke. But what if they had chosen silence? What if just once Fred had gone quiet, had looked at his brother, pale and bloodied, and realized the stakes? That moment never comes. When Fred dies in the Battle of Hogwarts, it is sudden. A wall collapses and he's gone. And that's the last time he ever laughed, the narration tells us. And that line is supposed to be poignant. But because we never saw Fred truly grapple with the possibility of death, his end feels like a trick of fate, not the climax of a personal arc. He didn't become something. He just stopped being. There is, of course, a counter-argument that Fred and George are meant to be symbols, that their constancy is the point. They are laughter in darkness, light in despair, that by staying the same they preserve something vital in the world, but even symbols must crack, even light flickers. Their refusal to change turns them into caricatures, not characters. And in a story so deeply rooted in pain, choice, and redemption, the choice feels hollow. When Sirius Black dies, Harry screams. The world tilts. When Dobby dies, the entire scene slows and Harry digs the grave himself. These moments linger because they are earned. They come after connection, after vulnerability. Fred's death, though tragic, feels like the end of a running joke. There's a punchline in the silence. It's not fair to the reader, and it's not fair to Fred. Even Molly Weasley, the ever-maternal figure, has an arc. She shifts from homemaker to fierce warrior. Her battle with Bellatrix Lestrange is legendary. "Not my daughter, you bitch!" she screams, becoming both protector and avenger. She changes, she suffers, she grows. The twins, they remain frozen in time, forever 17, forever laughing. One might ask, is it wrong to remain joyful in the face of war? Perhaps not. But joy without reflection is just noise. Fred and George deserved more than that. They deserved doubt, anger, love, grief, mistakes. They deserved a scene where they watched a friend fall and couldn't make a joke, a moment where they chose silence over mischief, a night they couldn't sleep. They are not alone in this. Other side characters also remain mostly flat, but none so central, none so loved. The twins were more than comic relief. They were family, big brothers, creators, rebels. They stood with Harry when it counted. They fought. But they never truly changed, and that is the loss that no spell can mend. In a series that teaches us that people can grow, fall, and rise again, that even the worst can repent and the best can falter, Fred and George remain static stars in a shifting sky. It is not that they lacked the potential, it's that the story didn't let them reach for it. Their arc is a straight line, bright but flat. And when that line is suddenly cut, all we're left with is silence, a joke half told, a spark that never became a fire. Number 20, they mock those who don't fit in. It was always laughter first with Fred and George Weasley. From the moment they exploded onto the Hogwarts Express with exploding sweets, enchanted fireworks, and pockets full of chaos, they earned their place in the hearts of readers as the fun, rebellious twins. But behind the clever jokes and glittering pranks there were moments, many in fact, where the joke wasn't harmless. Sometimes it was cruel, sometimes it hurt, and too often it was aimed at those who already felt like they didn't belong. Take Percy Weasley, their older brother. Percy, with his stiff collars and prefect's badge gleaming with pride, was a walking symbol of everything the twins rejected: rules, seriousness, ambition within the ministry. And Fred and George tore into him mercilessly. Big Head Boy, they called him, behind his back and to his face. "You're just jealous," Percy snapped once, red with frustration, "because I've actually got prospects." But the laughter only grew louder. For the twins, Percy was an easy target. Uptight, alone, desperate to be taken seriously, they didn't see a brother trying to prove himself in a large family where everyone had their role. They saw a caricature, a man begging to be ridiculed. But Percy wasn't the only one. Hermione Granger, muggle-born and brilliant, was often the object of their mockery. "You need to sort out your priorities," Ron once told her. But Fred and George took it further. They rolled their eyes at her every correction. They mimicked her voice when she quoted books. They dismissed her constant reading and rule-following with exaggerated groans and exaggerated yawns. "Oh, here comes the library again," George said in Goblet of Fire, when Hermione reminded them of magical lore. It was easy to call it light teasing, boys being boys, but it chipped away. She was already fighting for respect in a world that saw her blood as inferior. She didn't need her friends' brothers making her feel smaller still. And Luna Lovegood, sweet, spacey, endlessly kind Luna, was a punching bag wrapped in laughter. They didn't always aim their fire directly at her, but when others called her Loony Lovegood, they didn't object. They didn't stop the jokes or the whispers. "She's nice," said Ginny once. "She's just different." But different was enough. Different always is. When Fred and George distributed their joke products, they laughed when Luna tried them, even when they knew the effects might last longer for her. She wasn't part of the crowd, she was outside of it, and the twins thrived inside the spotlight. To keep it, they needed someone else to stand in the shadows. It wasn't just students. When Dolores Umbridge seized power at Hogwarts, Fred and George became folk heroes for their pranks and rebellion. But while they battled oppression, they still found time to mock those they didn't like. Filch, the miserable caretaker, became a repeated victim. "He's part troll, I swear," Fred whispered once, loud enough for Filch to hear. Filch may have been unpleasant, but he was also isolated, mocked, dismissed, a man who lived alone, who had little magic, who had nothing but his rules. The twins didn't see pain, they saw a stage. Even Neville Longbottom, sweet, clumsy, heroic Neville, was caught in their crossfire. "It's a miracle he can find his way to class," Fred once joked after Neville had gotten lost again. This was in the early books, before Neville proved himself, before the world realized the quiet courage he carried. Back then he was the butt of the joke, always falling, always forgetting, always behind. And Fred and George, standing tall and laughing loud, made sure he stayed there. Fred and George had a powerful gift. They could make people laugh, but with great laughter comes great responsibility. Jokes carry weight, and when they targeted those already burdened, the lonely, the different, the unsure, it wasn't funny. It was cruel. The moment that made it clearest came in Goblet of Fire, when Hermione started SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare. While Ron mocked her, Fred and George joined in with glee. "Has she started knitting them socks yet?" George asked, grinning. "Maybe we should free some elves too." They didn't care about the cause. They didn't listen to her arguments. They dismissed it all with a joke. For Hermione, it was a moment of activism, trying to fight systemic injustice. For the twins, it was an opportunity to sneer. Some might argue it was harmless fun, that Fred and George were equal opportunity jokers. But the pattern reveals something else. They didn't mock the strong. They didn't ridicule those who could fight back. They laughed at those already vulnerable, those on the edge of belonging. It's not that Fred and George were villains, they weren't. They were brilliant, brave, and full of love for their family. But that love had boundaries. It didn't always extend to understanding. It didn't always include compassion for those who were different. When Fred died in Deathly Hallows, the world mourned, and rightly so. His death was tragic, senseless, a loss of light in a dark war, but death doesn't erase flaws, it sharpens them. It reminds us of what might have been, what growth was never allowed to happen. Fred died as he lived, laughing, but maybe, just maybe, he was on the cusp of learning when not to. George, who survived, carried more than just grief. He carried memory. And maybe with that memory came reflection. Maybe he thought of the times he laughed too loud and listened too little. Maybe he remembered how Percy, the brother they had mocked most, came back in the end. And maybe that taught him something about dignity and forgiveness and the damage a joke can do. Even within the Weasley family, there were fractures. Percy distanced himself from them for years, not just because of ambition, but because he never felt truly seen. When he did return, the hug from George was real. But the road back was long. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry was isolated and called a liar, Fred and George stood by him. But they also ridiculed anyone who questioned their view of the world. When Luna spoke of strange creatures, they didn't listen. When others cried injustice, they made a product. Joke shops can be magical places, but they can also be weapons. Laughter can heal, it can also wound. The twins knew how to set off fireworks, but they didn't always know how to stop the sparks from burning. There was a moment, a small one, in Half-Blood Prince, when George noticed how withdrawn Hermione had become. "She's been quiet lately," he said. Fred shrugged. "She's probably reading." And they laughed again, but there was something different in George's eyes. A hesitation, a pause, perhaps guilt, perhaps growth. And in the final battle, it was Luna who guided others. It was Neville who destroyed the last Horcrux. It was Hermione who stood by Harry through it all. The mocked, the dismissed, the weird ones, they were the heart of the resistance. Fred and George had their moments of heroism. They left school in a blaze of rebellion, daring others to dream bigger. But they also left behind a trail of laughter that sometimes sounded too much like cruelty. There's bravery in battle, but there's also bravery in kindness, in seeing someone's strangeness and embracing it, in noticing a quiet voice and amplifying it, in choosing not to make a joke, even when it's easy. Number 21, their rebellion against Umbridge hurt others. The moment Fred and George Weasley launched their infamous rebellion against Dolores Umbridge, the atmosphere at Hogwarts was electric. Explosions of vivid fireworks danced across the enchanted ceilings, screeching dragons and spinning Catherine wheels clattering through corridors as students cheered. The scene felt almost cinematic, a much-needed flash of rebellion in a school suffocating under the thumb of a ministry puppet. But behind the cheers and chaos, the impact of their actions ran deeper than most dared to admit. It was more than spectacle. It was disruption, glorious, reckless, and for many, harmful. Dolores Umbridge had indeed transformed Hogwarts into something oppressive and alien. Her rules choked the spontaneity out of student life. She censored books, muzzled teachers, and punished dissent with a cruelty that bordered on sadism. Still, when Fred and George orchestrated their defiant exodus in Order of the Phoenix, flying out of the school on broomsticks after unleashing a swamp in the East Wing, it left behind more than rebellious laughter. It left a fractured school even more broken. The swamp, for one, became more than just a visual metaphor for the mess that Hogwarts had become. It was literal. Desks were displaced. First-year students cried when they couldn't reach classrooms. Even Peeves, the resident poltergeist, began to idolize the twins, escalating his own brand of mischief. Filch tried desperately to contain the damage, but without magic of his own, his efforts were laughable. Teachers, forbidden from assisting in the cleanup, stood by, helpless. "I'm not paid to clean up this mess," Professor Sinistra reportedly muttered when she passed the corridor, turned Marsh. For students like Hannah Abbott and Susan Bones, those who relied on structure and calm to maintain their focus, the chaos became suffocating. Their grades slipped, their nerves frayed. They had barely recovered from the trauma of the previous year's Triwizard Tournament and Cedric's death. Now they were forced to navigate flooded hallways, skiving snack boxes scattered everywhere, and floating fireworks that occasionally burst into flames. What started as defiance against tyranny became collateral damage. Even teachers, though largely sympathetic to the twins' cause, struggled to maintain order. Professor Flitwick, despite his joviality, found it increasingly difficult to teach when students were distracted by screaming yo-yos or flying firecrackers that had nested in the chandeliers. "I could have removed that swamp in seconds," he confessed with a chuckle, "but I've rather grown fond of it." The comment, though witty, was a mask for exhaustion. Teachers were walking on tightropes, helped too much, and they would attract Umbridge's wrath. Do nothing, and the students suffered. One of the most troubling results of Fred and George's rebellion was the vacuum of leadership it created. They had become underground icons of resistance, running the joke shop, plotting mischief, distributing contraband. But when they left, that sense of hope crumbled for many students. They had been the faces of joyful defiance, a beacon in dark times. Their sudden disappearance felt like abandonment. Neville Longbottom, who had just begun to grow into his courage, looked lost. "They just flew away," he whispered, once in the common room, "and left the rest of us behind." It wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. Had Fred and George remained, they could have channeled the rebellion into something more organized, more sustainable. Dumbledore's army was already operating in the shadows, but the twins could have lent it credibility, structure, even protection. Instead, they exited in a blaze of glory. Their act was stunning, but it was just that, an act. A moment, not a movement. Dolores Umbridge, despite the chaos, used the event to her advantage. She cracked down harder. More rules were posted, more detentions handed out. She forced students like Lee Jordan into painful punishments for minor offences. The twins had poked the bear, but it was the rest of the school that felt the bear's claws. "The thing about rebels," whispered Terry Boot in the Ravenclaw common room, "is that sometimes they make things worse before they make them better." For Ginny Weasley, the departure of her brothers was bittersweet. Proud as she was of their stand, she felt their absence keenly. "They should have stayed," she said, through clenched teeth. "Not all of us have a shop to run or a vault full of gold from a joke competition." She had been building her own courage, finding her voice in Dumbledore's army. But now the pressure to carry on the rebellion fell on her and others like Luna and Neville, who lacked the twins' charisma and clout. In the Slytherin dormitories, meanwhile, Fred and George's antics only fueled resentment. Draco Malfoy capitalized on the chaos, reporting students he didn't like under the guise of maintaining order. "You're either with the law," he sneered in potions, "or with the swamp." The twins' rebellion inadvertently gave him a platform. He wasn't enforcing justice, he was weaponizing fear, and he was good at it. Even the house elves, though largely invisible in the daily narrative of Hogwarts, suffered the consequences. The swamp meant extra cleaning. The fireworks left scorch marks and holes in the tapestries. The twins' chaos, though magical and awe-inspiring, fell on the backs of those who had no say in the matter. "Dobby is not sure if he likes the loud bangs," the elf once whispered to Harry, clutching his ears, "but Dobby still supports freedom." Even in his devotion, Dobby was conflicted. The library became a haven for those seeking refuge from the mayhem. Madame Pince, normally a strict guardian of silence, softened slightly. "At least here," she muttered, "the books don't explode." Hermione spent more time than ever among the stacks, trying to calm her nerves and help others with homework disrupted by the week's confusion. "They could have coordinated with us," she said sharply when someone praised the twins. "They didn't even tell Harry." Indeed, even Harry felt conflicted. As someone perpetually at odds with authority, he admired their bravery, but he also saw the fallout. The twins hadn't targeted Umbridge alone. Their chaos rippled outward. Teachers, students, and even the DA had to adjust. They left, he told Ron one evening, "and now we're the ones cleaning it up. Literally." There's no denying the romance of rebellion. Fred and George soared through the air like characters from a ballad, delivering poetic justice with a broomstick twist. But real change requires more than bold exits. It requires staying, fighting, building, and they didn't. They left Hogwarts with a bang, but those who remained had to live through the silence that followed. The moment when Fred and George let loose a fireworks dragon in the Great Hall was iconic. The creature twisted and turned through the air, roaring in defiance. But while the students clapped and laughed, Professors McGonagall and Sprout exchanged looks of concern. They knew the tide had shifted. McGonagall, ever the pragmatist, later murmured, "They've given Umbridge the very excuse she needs to tighten the leash." And she was right. Cho Chang, still reeling from Cedric's death and now distanced from Harry, found the chaos unbearable. "I can't think," she told Marietta. "It's like Hogwarts isn't Hogwarts anymore." Fred and George had intended to reclaim the spirit of the school, but to some they only buried it further in confusion and smoke. The dividing line between mischief and sabotage blurred that week. To Lavender Brown, the twins were heroes. To Ernie Macmillan, they were irresponsible. "Not all of us can fly away," he said bitterly. "Some of us have OWLs." It was a sentiment shared by many fifth years who saw their futures jeopardized by constant disruptions. And so the legend of the swamp grew. It became a symbol of rebellion, yes, but also of irresponsibility. Even after Umbridge was gone, the scars remained. Some students laughed every time they passed the corridor. Others hurried through, heads down, remembering the chaos, the shouting, the fear. A student's rebellion had been poetic, but for Hogwarts the poetry had teeth. Fred and George weren't villains. They were brave, brilliant, hilarious, but they were also impulsive. And in their final act at Hogwarts they chose the path of spectacle over solidarity. They turned pain into performance, rebellion into entertainment. The crowd roared, the sky exploded in light. Number 22, they avoided real responsibility. Fred and George Weasley were beloved by everyone at Hogwarts, their pranks, their inventions, their effortless charm. Everything about them seemed to shimmer with mischief and light. But behind that sparkle, behind the firework-laced chaos of their joke shop, lay a quieter truth. In a world being swallowed by fear and darkness, they had stepped back. Not entirely, not cowardly, but deliberately. They had avoided true responsibility. While others bled and broke for the cause, Fred and George built a business. When the Second Wizarding War began to fester, the world around them was changing. People were making choices that defined them, choices that separated the brave from the safe. Members of the Order of the Phoenix were returning to dangerous missions, infiltrating Death Eater circles, fighting in battles that could end their lives. Dumbledore's army was preparing in secret, learning spells that no Hogwarts curriculum dared to teach. And Fred and George, they were painting signs for Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, trying to choose which product would attract more buyers, decoy detonators or skiving snack boxes. It isn't that their work was useless, far from it. Their inventions had real value in the war effort. The Ministry under Umbridge was a farce, corrupted, blind, oppressive. Their joke products became survival tools. Peruvian instant darkness powder, for instance, helped many escape dangerous encounters, and the shield hats they designed were so effective, the Ministry had no choice but to buy them in bulk. But these contributions, while clever and useful, were from the sidelines. Their shop was a safe haven, a bright distraction, not a battlefield. Compare this to their brother Bill. Bill Weasley was mauled by Fenrir Greyback while working for the Order, putting his life on the line to protect others. Or Charlie, who, though less present, continued to coordinate from Romania, doing everything he could for the cause. Even Ron, the youngest of the brothers, left his safe space at home to go on the run with Harry and Hermione, sleeping in forests, braving the unknown, carrying the emotional weight of the Horcrux. Fred and George, meanwhile, remained in Diagon Alley, visible, yes, brave in their own way, certainly, but untouched by the daily horror their peers endured. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Fred casually says, "Business is booming," as if the war outside their shop window hadn't reached them. Their brightly coloured storefront stood in stark contrast to the rising gloom. The wizarding world was at war, and their most urgent concern was customer demand. One could argue that someone had to keep the light alive, that humour and joy are their own kind of resistance. And there's truth in that. Fred and George brought laughter when it was most needed, reminded people of hope, but there's a difference between offering hope and shouldering the burden of change. They didn't attend order meetings, they didn't go on missions, they didn't train young witches and wizards for battle. They chose a different kind of fight, one that cost less and gained more. Consider their reaction when Harry proposed a serious plan. In Deathly Hallows, when the trio planned to destroy Horcruxes, Fred and George remained at Shell Cottage, away from the front lines. Fred even joked, "When we've got our answer, we'll be the ones laughing, deflecting, avoiding." They were always near, but never in the heart of it. The truth is, their actions, while never malicious, often danced around responsibility. Even in school, they were known more for disrupting order than protecting it. Their dramatic exit from Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix was celebrated by students, but it left behind no legacy of leadership. They didn't stay to help Harry, Hermione and Ron resist Umbridge. They didn't organize students or teach spells. Instead, they left spectacularly to chase their dream of a joke shop. Again, chasing dreams is not a flaw, but in a time of crisis it becomes a choice. When Hogwarts turned into a prison and students needed every ounce of courage they could find, Fred and George prioritized their ambitions. In Order of the Phoenix, they launched their fireworks, disrupted the tyrannical rule of Umbridge, and left without looking back. Noble? Perhaps, but also escapist. Their message to the younger students wasn't, "Fight with us." It was, "Good luck, we're out." Contrast this with the Neville Longbottom. Neville, once bumbling and forgotten, rose to the challenge. He stayed at Hogwarts when it became dangerous. He led the resistance. He took beatings, lived in the room of requirement, and never once thought of leaving. Neville grew into a leader. Fred and George remained legends of laughter, but sidestepped the weight of responsibility that leadership demands. It's not that Fred and George didn't care. Their support was always offered, at weddings, at meetings, in casual conversations. But there is a difference between supporting and sacrificing, between helping from behind and stepping into fire. The night Dobby died, and the trio arrived at Shell Cottage broken and shaken, Fred and George offered beds, hot food, comfort. But they weren't the ones who rescued Luna from Malfoy Manor. They weren't the ones being hunted by the Snatchers. Their hands were clean. The Battle of Hogwarts was the first time we truly saw Fred Weasley in the thick of it. He stood alongside Percy, finally shoulder to shoulder with his older brother, defending the school that made him who he was. And in that moment, ironically, perhaps tragically, he became a hero. He paid the price of battle, the ultimate price. That night, he was no longer a sideline joker. He died a fighter, he died laughing, and in that final act, Fred stepped into the place he had avoided for so long. It begs the question, what might have changed if he had done so earlier? Could his courage, his charm, his wit have empowered others? Could his presence in the Order have inspired more unity? Could his leadership at Hogwarts have protected students? We'll never know. Because until that final battle, Fred and George kept their distance. They were near, but not immersed. George, after Fred's death, became a different man. The spark dimmed, the The laughter that once defined him became hollow. In many ways, it felt like a punishment for not taking more seriously what was at stake. The shop survived, but the soul behind it cracked. George's grief was quiet, heavy, irreversible, and perhaps that grief was rooted not just in loss, but in guilt. One scene that stands out is in Deathly Hallows during the preparation for the 7 Potters. Fred and George participate, yes, they take Polyjuice Potion, become decoys, but again, this is a single task, a cameo of bravery. It's not a pattern. They weren't there for the months of hiding, of sabotage, of survival. Their involvement was always brief, always reactive, never enduring. We must also remember Ginny, youngest, yet fiercest. Ginny trained with Dumbledore's army, fought in both Hogwarts battles, endured the Cruciatus curse, and never once hid. Even Molly Weasley, a mother, entered the final battle and killed Bellatrix Lestrange with a fury that made history. The Weasley family was full of warriors. Fred and George, despite all their potential, lagged behind. Their fear wasn't of death. Fred proved that in the end. Their fear was of being serious, of giving up the light-hearted persona they had so carefully built. Responsibility meant admitting that the world was broken, that it couldn't be fixed with laughter alone. And perhaps that truth was too much for them to face. So they smiled and sold and cheered from the sidelines. Their shop was their fortress. And yes, it provided hope, but in times of war, hope without action is just a story. Fred and George were brilliant inventors, but they weren't soldiers, not until the end. And by then, for Fred, it was too late. His laughter echoed one last time in the halls of Hogwarts before the walls came crashing down. Their legacy is complicated. They inspired joy, invented tools, and gave the world a reason to smile. But they also refused to lead when it mattered most. They avoided the burden of command. They avoided the heartbreak of frontline war. They chose safety, not sacrifice, and only in the final hour did they face what others had faced for months. There's something deeply human in that choice. Not everyone is a Harry or a Hermione. Not everyone is a Neville. But there is a cost to delaying courage. Fred paid that cost. George lives with it. And the world remembers them not just for their laughter, but for the silence before the fight. Number 23, they encouraged a culture of impunity. Of all the mischievous students who ever walked the halls of Hogwarts, none left a more unforgettable mark than Fred and George Weasley. These identical twins, born to a family of modest means but overflowing in spirit, turned mischief into an art form. But their legacy, though admired by many, carries a darker undertone. Their relentless pranks, rebellious spirit, and blatant disregard for authority did not merely provide comic relief. They created a culture where rules became optional, and chaos was cloaked in charm. What started as harmless fun steadily evolved into a silent rebellion that reshaped the school's atmosphere in ways most failed to recognize. Fred and George did not merely break rules, indeed they ignored them altogether. While other students tiptoed along the lines of school regulations, the Weasley twins bulldozed right through. During their time at Hogwarts, they operated as if the rulebook was merely a suggestion. Their products, from Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, skiving snack boxes, Tun-Tung toffees, and portable swamps, were more than clever inventions. They were instruments of defiance, distributed with a grin, encouraging younger students to do the same. They weren't just selling candy, they were selling an attitude. One vivid moment that highlights this occurred in Order of the Phoenix, when Fred and George created a portable swamp in a school corridor. It wasn't just a prank, it was a statement. Umbridge's regime, oppressive as it was, had created tension, but instead of organizing thoughtful resistance, the twins turned to chaos. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred called out, as they made their legendary exit from Hogwarts. It was theatrical, bold, and wildly irresponsible. In that moment, the audience cheered. But what about the message? sent to the students left behind. Students like Dennis Creevey, just a few years younger, idolized Fred and George. Their antics weren't seen as defiance with consequences. They were glamorized. The more outrageous the prank, the more admiration they received. Responsibility, respect for school rules, or even simple classroom decorum was devalued. Being clever and entertaining became the new measure of worth. For the impressionable, this was dangerously intoxicating. Rules became jokes, teachers became targets, learning took a back seat. Even teachers, and those meant to uphold discipline, were caught in the spell. Professor Flitwick, charms master and Ravenclaw head of a house, once said, "I must admit the swamp was a good bit of magic." That's an educator commending a pair of students who intentionally disrupted the school environment. It may seem like a small moment, a quick quip, but it reveals something deeper. Authority was complicit. When teachers laugh, students learn that disruption isn't just tolerated, it's endorsed. Fred and George's behavior wasn't born in a vacuum. The twins had grown up in a loud, boisterous household, often overshadowed by their older brother's accomplishments, Bill's academic success, Charlie's dragon-wrangling bravado, Percy's polished ambition. In contrast, the twins carved out a different niche. They couldn't outshine their siblings by following rules. So they did the opposite. Their rebellion wasn't just toward Hogwarts, but toward a world that often told them they weren't enough. The danger was they brought others along for the ride. In Goblet of Fire, their obsession with entering the Triwizard Tournament despite being underage became another moment of irresponsible inspiration. They brewed an aging potion, risking magical backlash, simply to force themselves into a competition designed for students over 17. When their plan failed, the result wasn't punishment or concern. They were laughed off. Their beards grew rapidly, their bodies hurled from the goblet's perimeter. Even Dumbledore smiled. But what did that teach? That dangerous magic is acceptable if it's funny? Ron, their younger brother, simultaneously admired and feared them. He once remarked, "I always thought they were mental." Yet even he was caught up in their orbit. When the twins bullied Dudley with a Tung-Tung toffee in Goblet of Fire, their mother was horrified. But Ron? He was delighted. "It was brilliant!" he exclaimed. Again, the lesson was clear. Humiliation is acceptable if it comes wrapped in laughter. Even cruelty could be fun. Perhaps the most striking example of the culture they created came during Umbridge's reign. Faced with tyranny, Fred and George didn't attempt to build unity or organize protests. They escalated disorder. While Dumbledore's army, led by Harry, Hermione, and Ron, sought to empower students through education and preparedness, Fred and George offered fireworks and chaos. In Order of the Phoenix, they set off enchanted fireworks that exploded in mid-air, roared like dragons, and refused to vanish. The spectacle was dazzling, but also reckless. Instead of helping students resist meaningfully, they encouraged mockery. The war against Umbridge became a circus. There's a crucial difference between rebellion and sabotage. Harry's leadership of Dumbledore's army was strategic, purposeful. Fred and George, they just wanted to watch it all burn so long as it got a laugh. When they finally left Hogwarts on broomsticks, they were hailed as heroes. But what legacy did they leave? A school in disarray, teachers wary of being pranked, first years emboldened to defy prefects. Fred and George didn't just bend the rules, they twisted the moral compass of an entire student body. It's not that they were evil, far from it. Their intentions were rarely malicious. But intent doesn't erase impact, and the impact was a normalization of disrespect. Take, for instance, how they treated Percy. Yes, Percy could be pompous, but their mockery wasn't just teasing. It was relentless. They composed songs about him, impersonated his voice, and undermined his position in the ministry at every turn. Their siblings laughed, but to Percy it was humiliation. Eventually it contributed to his estrangement from the family. Mockery in the Weasley twins' world was a bonding ritual, even at the cost of real relationships. In Half-Blood Prince, Fred and George's joke shop becomes a smashing success. They're no longer pranksters, they're entrepreneurs, but even then their products often border on dangerous. Pygmy puffs and shield hats are amusing enough, but love potions? That's a different matter. These potions could seriously manipulate emotions, breach consent, and lead to unpredictable consequences. But in the twins' shop, they're just another product on the shelf, brightly coloured, labelled with humour. Real warnings? Nowhere in sight. The problem lies in the message. If it's fun, it must be harmless. But the wizarding world, as we know, is full of magic with consequences. In the wrong hands, even the silliest invention can become a weapon. And when you encourage disregard for those consequences, when you teach students that rules are for the dull and fun is king, you open a dangerous door. Ironically, Fred's death in the Battle of Hogwarts is often used to paint the twins in a tragic light. And it was tragic, heartbreaking. A boy who brought laughter to so many was silenced forever. But his death also forces us to reckon with his life. What did Fred stand for? Joy, rebellion, freedom, or a refusal to ever grow up? In a time of war, where discipline, unity, and maturity were needed, Fred and George sold fireworks. They didn't build Hogwarts defences. They didn't train students. They made people laugh. There's a line in Order of the Phoenix that always lingers. After their final prank, as they vanish into the sky, someone says, "I wish they'd left a bit more of a mess." And that's the problem. The mess wasn't physical, it was cultural. It lingered in the corridors, in the smirks of students who stopped respecting curfew, in the eyes of teachers who gave up trying to control chaos. The twins didn't just disrupt, they destabilized. Even Hermione, who usually had little patience for rule-breaking, was sometimes caught smiling at their antics, but deep down, she knew the cost. "Just because it's funny doesn't mean it's right," she once told Ron. Her words echo in the wake of the twins' legacy. Because once a line is crossed enough times, it disappears. Fred and George didn't see the line, or worse, they erased it. They were brilliant, undeniably, creative, clever, charming. But brilliance without responsibility is a dangerous thing. Fred and George turned Hogwarts into a stage, and every rule, every teacher, every tradition became their prop. Their influence spread like wildfire, intoxicating students who believed that if you were clever enough, you could get away with anything. That punishment was for the dull. That humor justifies harm. Their story is a lesson, not in how to laugh, but in what happens when laughter blinds us. When we celebrate disruption without reflection, when charm excuses everything. Fred and George Weasley may have been the kings of comedy, but in their court, rules meant nothing, and the kingdom they left behind was forever changed. Number 24, they never took Ron seriously. Fred and George Weasley were legends at Hogwarts. Their brilliance, mischief, and charm made them icons in the wizarding world, and they wielded humor like a wand, with power, precision, and recklessness. But within the sparkle of their laughter and the echo of their pranks, there existed an unnoticed shadow. It belonged to their younger brother, Ronald Bilious Weasley, a boy with kind eyes, long arms, and a heart full of silent doubts. What was comedy to Fred and George was often a quiet humiliation for Ron, and their never-ending jokes had consequences that neither twin ever truly considered. From the very beginning, Ron was the tag-along. When the twins boarded the Hogwarts Express for the first time, he was still at home, watching with wide eyes as his brothers laughed and roared, and took over the train like it was their private stage. Even at 4 or 5 years old, he must have understood something, that they were golden and he was not. As he later told Harry in The Philosopher's Stone, Everyone expects me to do as well as the others, but if I do, it's no big deal because they did it first. Fred and George were the worst offenders, always waving away his efforts as something to be laughed at, not admired. One of the earliest and most painful examples came when Ron was just about to start his first year at Hogwarts. Nervous, uncertain, and wearing hand-me-down robes and a wand with a bit of tape on it, Ron stepped onto the train. And there were Fred and George, already celebrities. "Ron's got something on his nose," George said casually, pointing it out to everyone in the compartment. Ron reddened immediately. The twins weren't being cruel, not deliberately. But that was the problem. They didn't see Ron's embarrassment as something real. It was just fuel for their next joke. At Hogwarts, the pattern only worsened. Fred and George treated the school like their playground, and Ron was often the unwilling prop in their antics. He was the target of dung bombs, the butt of jokes about his rat scabbers, and the helpless recipient of endless teasing about his fears, especially of spiders. "Can't even go into the garden anymore because Fred turned my teddy bear into a great big spider when I was 3, Ron once confessed bitterly. And even as he told the story, there was a hint of something deeper beneath the humour. That wasn't just a prank, that was trauma, neatly brushed aside by a laugh. It didn't stop in private. Fred and George's lack of seriousness toward Ron was something they proudly displayed to others. During Quidditch practice, even when Ron finally made it onto the Gryffindor team as keeper, his performance was not protected by brotherly pride. No, it was Fred and George who mimicked his saves and dropped exaggerated "great save, Ron" exclamations. When Ron's confidence was already fragile, their sarcasm was a wrecking ball. What they saw as harmless ribbing reinforced Ron's deepest fear, that he was a joke to everyone, even his own blood. When Ron received a prefect badge in his 5th year, it should have been a moment of pride. He had finally done something first, something not expected. But even then, Fred's response was sharp. "Wow, who would have thought Ron the prefect?" The tone was playful, but the sting was real. Fred and George had never taken rules seriously, and suddenly their kid brother had risen above them in the eyes of authority. Rather than congratulate him, they mocked him. Again. It was another chance to remind Ron he was still beneath them in their eyes, no matter what badge he wore. In The Half-Blood Prince, when Ron begins to experience success in Quidditch, George offers a rare moment of praise, saying Ron has finally pulled it out of the bag. But even then, it's backhanded, implying that they never expected anything good from him. It wasn't "you did great, Ron," or "we're proud of you." It was surprise. The kind you feel when someone you never took seriously suddenly proves they're not entirely useless. And while Ron may have smiled, part of him surely felt the jab. The irony is that Fred and George, for all their brilliance, never truly saw how brave Ron was. He followed Harry Potter into danger again and again, into the Forbidden Forest, into the Chamber of Secrets, into the Department of Mysteries. He stood beside Hermione, wand shaking but firm, when others ran. He faced down Death Eaters, played wizard chess like a general at war, and willingly walked into darkness for those he loved. Yet to Fred and George he was still the little brother with something on his nose, the one who couldn't keep his nerves on a broomstick. The most painful example came when Fred and George unveiled their joke shop. Ron had longed for some financial independence, a sign that he mattered. But instead of helping him find that pride, the twins gifted him, gifted, not offered, a box of free joke items. It was generosity, yes. But it was also a reminder they were the entrepreneurs, the inventors, the brilliant ones. He was still the consumer. Even as he said thank you, there was a flicker in his eyes. Because it wasn't about the items, it was about being seen. And Fred and George never truly saw Ron. When Harry was chosen as a Triwizard champion in the Goblet of Fire, Ron's jealousy became a temporary wedge between the two friends, but it was also telling that Ron expected betrayal. He expected not to be told the truth. He expected, as he always had, to be left out of the circle where things mattered. This deep-rooted insecurity wasn't born from Harry. It came from years of being underestimated, laughed at, brushed aside. It came from a lifetime of being the sixth Weasley boy, and the one who always seemed just a bit behind. In Deathly Hallows, the tension between the brothers reached a quiet, tragic climax. When Ron abandoned the Horcrux hunt, tormented by the locket's illusions and inner fears, he saw visions of Harry and Hermione together, laughing at him. The locket played on his deepest wounds. And who put them there? Not the locket, not even Harry. They were planted by years of being made to feel small, of being the joke, of being told, with every smirk and prank, that he wasn't enough. Fred and George were never cruel, but they were careless, and sometimes that's worse. Ron's outburst in that moment was heart-wrenching. "You think I don't know how this feels? You think I don't know what it's like to be the one who's always left out?" That wasn't just about Harry and Hermione. That was about his whole life. A silent scream that had been building for years, one prank at a time, one offhand comment at a time, from brothers who should have been his shield, but were too busy laughing to notice the arrows. Even after Ron rejoined the group, there was no conversation about the deeper hurt. The wizarding world was falling apart and there was no time, but you could see it in Ron. The way he stood a little straighter, the way he spoke with more certainty. Something had broken in him, and something new had grown in its place. A version of Ron that no longer needed Fred and George's approval. A man who had walked through fire and come out burned, but stronger. When Fred died during the Battle of Hogwarts, Ron's world shattered. There was no final word, no apology, no recognition of what had passed between them. Just silence. And in that silence, perhaps Ron forgave him. Or perhaps he didn't need to. Perhaps he finally understood that Fred, for all his brilliance, had never known what it was like to live in someone else's shadow. Fred had never needed to prove his worth. It had always been obvious. Ron had to fight for every ounce of it. It is tempting to say that Fred and George loved Ron, and of course they did. But love without understanding can sometimes hurt more than hate. They never hated Ron. They simply never respected him. Not truly. And respect is the soil where confidence grows. Without it, Ron grew up with roots full of doubt, always bending toward the approval he never received, always wondering if he was worthy. Even in the aftermath of the war, when George mourned his twin and rebuilt the shop, Ron stood beside him. He offered quiet help, not jokes. He had grown into the kind of man Fred might have finally admired. But it had taken years of pain to get there. And much of it was avoidable, if only Fred and George had once, just once, said the words, "We believe in you, Ron." Hermione once said, "Just because you have the emotional range of a teaspoon doesn't mean we all have." It was meant for Ron, but in truth it applied just as easily to Fred and George. They were brilliant with jokes, but blind to feelings, and Ron, all heart and nerves, needed something more than punchlines. The story of Fred and George and Ron isn't one of cruelty, it's one of neglect, of a failure to see that behind Ron's temper, behind his sarcasm and sulking, was a boy desperate to be told he mattered, not just as a brother, but as Ron, the brave, loyal, funny, flawed boy who never stopped trying, the boy who deserved to be taken seriously. And maybe, somewhere beyond the veil, Fred finally sees it. Maybe he's proud now, but Ron had to walk that road alone. And for all their brilliance, Fred and George missed their chance to walk it with him. Number 25. They could be cruel even to friends. Fred and George Weasley are two of the most beloved characters in the Harry Potter universe, known for their wit, charm, and incredible ability to find humour even in the darkest of times. They brought light to Hogwarts during the reign of Umbridge, made people laugh when they wanted to cry, and showed immense bravery in the face of evil. But behind their charm and comedic timing, there existed a darker truth. Fred and George, for all their lovable traits, often used humour as a weapon. Their jokes weren't always harmless. In fact, some of them bordered on cruelty, especially when directed at those they called friends. Take Hermione Granger, for instance, the brightest witch of her age, and someone who, despite being younger than the twins, often stood her ground against them. Fred and George never missed a chance to mock her studious nature. To them, Hermione's love of books and rules made her an easy target. "Honestly, you'd think she'd spend more time trying to have fun," Fred once muttered, rolling his eyes as Hermione gave Harry and Ron a detailed explanation about Polyjuice Potion. Their sarcasm wasn't just occasional teasing, it was persistent, wearing. While Hermione was strong enough to ignore most of it, there were moments when their words clearly cut deeper than they realized. Neville Longbottom bore an even greater brunt of their humour. Kind-hearted, shy, and perpetually nervous, Neville was an easy target for bullies. Fred and George didn't bully in the traditional sense, but their jokes about Neville's forgetfulness and clumsiness often drew laughter from the common room. "Watch out, Neville's about to trip over his own wand," George once joked, causing Seamus and Dean to burst into laughter. Neville chuckled weakly, but his eyes darted away, embarrassment blooming on his cheeks. The twins didn't mean harm, perhaps, but harm was often done regardless. The line between teasing and torment was often blurred. One memorable moment came when Fred and George convinced a gullible first-year Dennis Creevy that the third floor was haunted by a ghost who only attacked students wearing yellow socks. "You'll be safe if you wear pink," Fred had added solemnly. Poor Dennis showed up the next day in mismatched neon socks and a trembling lip. It was funny, until it wasn't. Until you realized that Dennis was just trying to fit in. Even Ron, their younger brother, wasn't spared. Growing up in the shadow of their brilliance, because make no mistake, Fred and George were brilliant, Ron often found himself the butt of their jokes. They poked fun at his Quidditch failures, his prefect badge, Blimey, who died and made you Percy, and even his pet rat, Scabbers. While Ron laughed along most of the time, there were moments, fleeting but real, when you saw the flicker of hurt behind his freckled face. There's the incident with the Tung-Tung toffee, perhaps the most infamous example of the twins' lack of boundaries. It was meant as a joke, they claimed, just a bit of fun, but to give a child an enchanted sweet that causes their tongue to swell up to 4 feet? That's not a prank, that's dangerous. "It was brilliant," George cried when they recounted it later. But to Dudley, choking and panicking, it was terrifying. And to Harry, who watched his cousins suffer, it was confusing. Did they really need to go that far? Jokes have power. They can comfort and unite, but they can also humiliate and isolate. Fred and George wielded their humour like a blade, sometimes carefully, but too often recklessly. They turned people's insecurities into punchlines. When they mocked Percy's seriousness, it wasn't just sibling teasing, it was a deliberate attempt to undermine his ambitions. Percy wouldn't recognize a joke if it danced naked in front of him wearing Dobby's tea cozy, Fred quipped once. It was funny, but it also deepened the rift between Percy and the rest of the family. At school, their pranks weren't always received with laughter. Remember the time they filled a corridor with swamp? It was legendary, yes, but what about the students who had exams and had to navigate around it? What about Filch, the caretaker, who had to clean it all up? And what about the shy Hufflepuff girl who slipped and broke her arm in the chaos? No one talks about that part of the story. Lee Jordan, their closest friend and partner in crime, laughed the loudest at their jokes, but even he had moments of discomfort. There were times when Fred and George pushed him to participate in pranks that went beyond his comfort zone. During one stunt involving enchanted fireworks, Lee hesitated. "Are you sure this won't hurt anyone?" he asked. "Don't be such a ministry drone," George replied with a grin. Lee went along with it. But you could tell he wasn't fully on board. Angelina Johnson, too, had a complex relationship with the twins. As a fellow Gryffindor and Quidditch teammate, she shared countless laughs with them. But during practice, when Fred joked about her leadership style, "Look out, it's Professor Johnson again," there was a flicker of annoyance. Angelina was trying to lead, to be taken seriously. Their constant joking undermined that effort, even if unintentionally. Alicia Spinett once received a nose-biting teacup as a gift from the twins. It clamped down on her lip and left a mark for days. They laughed hysterically. "You should have seen your face," George said between chuckles. Alicia smiled faintly but didn't talk to them for a week. It was just a prank, yes, but it came with a cost. There's a particularly cruel moment when Fred and George mock moaning Myrtle. "Hey, Myrtle," Fred called out once. "Any new boy victims in your bathroom lately?" It was meant to be a joke, but Myrtle, already miserable and mocked by most of the school, burst into ghostly tears and disappeared into a toilet. The twins didn't mean to be cruel, but they were. And their laughter echoed down the corridor long after she was gone. In their final year at Hogwarts, Fred and George opened their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. It was a dream come true and one they worked hard to achieve. But even here, their products occasionally crossed lines. Skiving snack boxes, which made students vomit or develop nosebleeds to skip class, were ingenious, but also irresponsible. Some students abused them. One girl fainted from overuse. The twins shrugged it off. Well, she did say she wanted out of History of Magic. Their philosophy often seemed to be, if you can laugh about it later, it's fine. Or because that's not how friendship works. Real friendship is about respect. It's about knowing when to stop. When Lee once confronted them about a prank that made a shy Ravenclaw boy cry, Fred rolled his eyes. "He'll toughen up. Hogwarts isn't for the faint-hearted." But Lee didn't laugh that time. Their humour was a shield too, a way to avoid vulnerability. When times were hard, they doubled down on jokes, but that often meant ignoring the feelings of others. In Order of the Phoenix, when things grew darker, their pranks became more extreme. They were rebelling, yes, but also distracting themselves from fear. Yet in doing so, they often failed to see who they were hurting. When Fred died in the Battle of Hogwarts, the world lost a spark. It was devastating, his laughter, his spirit, gone in a flash of cruel war. But in mourning him, we must also remember him truthfully. Fred was funny, he was brave, he was loved, but he wasn't perfect. None of them were. George, who survived, had to live with half of himself missing. In the quiet that followed, one wonders. Did he ever think back to the people they'd teased, the friends they'd mocked, the laughs that maybe went too far? Did he ever wish they'd said sorry just once, to Neville or to Hermione? In the end, Fred and George weren't villains. They were flawed. They were human. They made people laugh and made mistakes. Their story reminds us that humour, when used with empathy, can heal, but when used without care, it can hurt deeply, even those we love the most. Number 26. They used humour as a defence mechanism. Fred and George Weasley were the laughter of the Gryffindor common room, the inventors of portable swamps, and the kings of comic relief in the darkest corners of Hogwarts. But beneath the twinkling eyes and mischievous grins, lay something quieter, something few noticed unless they were really looking. For all their pranks and punchlines, the twins used humour as armour, laughter as a shield. Their jokes weren't just about entertainment. They were a way of surviving in a world where danger, grief, and uncertainty constantly loomed. From their earliest appearances, Fred and George delighted in chaos, whether they were enchanting snowballs to bounce off Professor Quirrell's turban in Philosopher's Stone, or charming a staircase to play rude tunes in Order of the Phoenix. They never missed a chance to be irreverent. They mocked authority, teased Percy relentlessly, and turned Peeves into a willing accomplice. But it wasn't just rebellion for rebellion's sake. The twins always seemed to know when people needed to laugh. When Umbridge's tyranny suffocated Hogwarts, Fred and George struck with their most spectacular stunt yet: fireworks, explosions, and a swamp that no one dared remove. It was an act of rebellion, yes, but it was also a lifeline for students who had forgotten how to smile. Still, the twins rarely, if ever, spoke seriously about their own lives. They never shared their fears or vulnerabilities, not even with Ron or Ginny. In fact, they often turned other people's serious concerns into jokes. When Harry was agonizing over the Triwizard Tournament, Fred quipped, "You're not going to get all soppy on us now, are you?" in Goblet of Fire. But that wasn't cruelty. It was avoidance. Because fear was a language the twins had never learned to speak openly. It was easier to turn terror into teasing, dread into distraction. Their jokes were often sharp, cutting through tension like a blade disguised in confetti. When Ron lay poisoned in the hospital wing in Half-Blood Prince, the mood was grim. Mrs. Weasley wept. Harry sat in guilt-stricken silence, but Fred and George arrived with levity, joking about being eaten by a Venus flytrap, and insisting on tasting the hospital food. It was classic misdirection. Draw the eyes to the laughter, so no one sees the shaking hands beneath the table. There was something almost sacred in the way Fred and George protected others through humour. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry faced isolation, betrayal, and the loss of Sirius Black, the twins kept showing up, not with lectures, but with laughter. They knew Harry didn't want sympathy, so they gave him distraction. A well-timed dung bomb, a joke about Percy's stick-up-the-robe posture, those were their offerings. Fred once said, "Time is galleons, little brother," but what he meant was, don't spend your days wallowing. Live loudly, laugh harder, because tomorrow might be war. They never talked about what the war cost them. When Bill was mauled by Fenrir Greyback, Fred and George were uncharacteristically quiet. Their jokes faltered, their smiles dimmed. But even then they didn't cry in public. They didn't rage. They helped Fleur plan the wedding. They kept making inventions. They kept the joke shop open. That was their way of coping, creating joy in the ruins. The very idea of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, their joke shop in Diagon Alley, was born out of this instinct. It wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary. Give the people what they need, Fred had said. And in a time of war, what they needed was to laugh. They made shield hats to protect against hexes, puking pastilles to fake illness and escape danger. Behind the silliness was a sharp mind, a protective instinct, and a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the only thing that keeps people going is the ability to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Fred and George never talked about their fears, but they showed them in subtle ways. In Deathly Hallows, during the flight of the 7 Potters, Fred risked everything without blinking. But the moment George was injured, his ear blasted off. Fred froze. Jokes tumbled out of his mouth even as his eyes were full of horror. He tried to name George St. George for losing an ear, but his voice cracked when he said it. It was the closest he ever came to admitting how terrified he was. That moment revealed the depth of their bond. Fred and George weren't just twins, they were halves of the same spirit. Where one went, the other followed. Their timing was so precise, their thoughts so entwined, that they often finished each other's sentences. Their synchronized laughter wasn't rehearsed, it was instinct. And so when Fred died during the Battle of Hogwarts, something broke that could never be mended. The books never linger on George's grief, but what we do see is haunting. George was very quiet now, J.K. Rowling wrote. That silence was more damning than any scream, because if George was quiet, then who was he? He had lost not just a brother, but a part of his own identity, his mirror, his echo, his partner in mischief. There were no jokes left to tell. Angelina Johnson, Fred's former flame, would later marry George. But even that union felt tinged with mourning, like a life rebuilt from ashes. Rowling confirmed in interviews that George was never the same. The joke shop stayed open, yes, but it was run by a man who laughed less and paused more. George couldn't produce a Patronus for years, she once said, and when he finally did, it was a hyena, a creature that laughs while mourning the dead. The absence of Fred echoed through every corridor of George's life, every prank they'd planned, every future they'd dreamed. It was all cut short by a moment of violence in a crumbling castle. And yet George didn't stop making people laugh. He continued because it was the only way he knew to honor his brother. To be the echo when the original voice had fallen silent. There's something deeply tragic about a man who laughs so others won't cry. It's a kind of quiet heroism we rarely recognize. Fred and George were never chosen ones. They weren't prophecy children or auras in training, but they were protectors in their own way, guardians of joy in a time of sorrow. Even their final prank, Fred's last words, were shrouded in irony. He was mid-laugh when he died, joking with Percy of all people. "You actually are joking, Percy. I don't think I've heard you joke since you were—" And then silence. The kind of silence that steals the air from the room. The kind that no joke can chase away. But Fred's death also gave Percy something back, his humanity. The brother he had scorned gave him forgiveness and laughter in the final seconds of his life. Fred's humor wasn't just a shield for himself, it was a balm for others. Even in death, he gave. George never learned how to live without his brother's voice beside him. The joke shop, once a chorus of twin laughter, became a quieter place, but it remained open. George kept making inventions. He trained young pranksters. He mentored his son, Fred II, named after the uncle he would never meet. The echo continued, faint but faithful. And yet George never again had someone who understood him the way Fred did. Their private language of glances and grins gone, their shared rhythm shattered. Some wounds don't bleed, they laugh instead. This is what makes their story so deeply human, not just the joy they gave the world, but the cost they paid for it. They masked pain with punchlines, buried grief beneath gags, but if you looked closely, the cracks showed. The laughter had edges, the jokes came faster. When the danger grew darker, they knew what they were doing, they just hoped no one else would notice. In the end, Fred and George were never truly fearless. They were brave in the way that clowns in the battlefield are brave, smiling as the bombs fall, dancing on broken glass. Their humor wasn't light. It was defiance, it was survival, and it was love shaped into laughter. Fred died laughing. George lived grieving. Together they built a legacy of joy in the face of despair. And every time someone in the wizarding world laughs a little louder, dreams a little weirder, or refuses to take fear seriously, that's the Weasley twins working their quiet magic. Because sometimes the funniest people are the ones who hurt the most. and the loudest laughs come from the deepest silences. Number 27. They never tried to reconnect with Percy. Fred and George Weasley were many things, brilliant, chaotic, fearless, but they were never the type to look back. Their laughter often echoed through the halls of the Burrow and Hogwarts alike, shielding them from the weight of the world. But not all wounds can be healed with a joke. And some, like the wound left by their estranged brother Percy, were never even properly addressed. For all their charm and energy, Fred and George never once extended a real olive branch to their older brother, choosing instead to weaponize humor as a shield against vulnerability. Percy Ignatius Weasley, proud prefect, by-the-book rule-follower, and the very embodiment of what Fred and George mocked, had always stood out from his siblings. Unlike Bill, with his dragon-charming flair, or Charlie, the wild Quidditch lover, Percy chose ambition. He craved order and respect, and for this he was the constant subject of ridicule. His dream was not of mischief, but of a name in the Ministry of Magic. And when the time came to choose between family and his career, Percy chose the latter, believing that the Ministry stood for truth. "I am a servant of the Ministry," he said, with a firmness that seemed to cut through the dining room like a blade. "And I will not stand here while you all tear it down." Fred and George, always the voices of rebellion, laughed in his face. They didn't consider that Percy might be scared, confused, or simply desperate to believe in something that gave his life structure. They never tried to see the world through Percy's eyes, not even once. Instead, they cloaked their disappointment in sarcasm. "You'd think he was the bloody minister himself," George once muttered after Percy stormed out of the house, even as Arthur and Molly Weasley sat in tearful silence, trying to understand what had gone so terribly wrong. The twins continued their jabs. During the Order of the Phoenix meetings, Percy's name became the butt of every joke. When Percy refused to acknowledge his family's allegiance to Dumbledore, George smirked and said, "Don't worry, Mum, Percy's just busy polishing Fudge's boots." The room erupted in laughter, but Molly didn't smile. She turned away, wiping her eyes with the hem of her apron. In their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, Fred and George even crafted a line of novelty items, poking fun at government officials, clearly inspired by their disdain for Percy's devotion to the ministry. There was a quill that wrote in ministry-approved language only, and a tie that choked the wearer if they tried to speak against authority. The implication was clear. Percy had become a joke in his brother's eyes, not a person. When Percy sent back his Christmas jumper, unopened and untouched, it was Molly who cried silently by the fireplace. Fred and George, however, brushed it off. "Well, at least he's spared the fashion disaster," Fred quipped, but even then there was a crack in his voice, small but audible. It was easier to laugh than to admit they missed their brother. Yet the truth was unavoidable. Percy hadn't just turned away from them. He'd turned toward something he thought was noble. Yes, he'd been wrong. The ministry was corrupt, and Percy had been used. But how could he have known? Fred and George, for all their brilliance, never offered him the benefit of doubt. They assumed stupidity, not loyalty, arrogance, not fear. And in doing so they left Percy alone, adrift. There was a moment, however, a single opportunity where things could have been different. It came during Bill and Fleur's wedding. Percy wasn't there, of course, but his absence was deafening. The dance floor was alive with music and laughter, but Fred stood on the edge of it all, watching his parents try not to look toward the empty corner where Percy might have stood. George approached with a goblet of mead and tried to pull him back into the crowd, but Fred shook his head. "He should be here," he said quietly. That was the moment, the one that might have changed everything. They could have written to him, walked to the ministry doors and said something real. Not a joke, not a prank, but something honest. "We miss you. Come home." But they never did. Instead, the silence hardened, calcifying into something unmovable. By the time Percy came back, really came back, it was during the Battle of Hogwarts. The castle was in chaos. Smoke and fire engulfed the great hall. Death Eaters screamed curses, and the dead lay in shadows. Percy, dishevelled and pale, appeared through the smoke like a ghost returning from exile. "Hello, Minister," he said stiffly to Pious Thickness before stunning him with a single blow. Then, turning to George, he whispered, "I'm sorry." George stared at him for a moment, blinking as if unsure the figure before him was real. "Percy?" he asked. It was the first time they had spoken in years. The apology had come, raw and real, but the moment of reconciliation was too brief, and fate too cruel. Because Fred died not long after. He died with laughter on his face in the middle of battle, next to his reconciled brother, in what George would later call the most unfair punchline the universe had ever delivered. Percy held Fred's body, and for the first time the rules and titles meant nothing. He was not a ministry man, he was a brother in mourning. It's impossible not to wonder, what if Fred and George had tried sooner? What if their sarcasm hadn't been the only language they spoke? Could they have given Percy a reason to come home earlier? Could Fred have lived long enough to make peace, not just in battle, but in brotherhood? Even after the war, George never really spoke of Percy with blame. But he didn't speak of him with warmth either. There was always a void, the kind that isn't loud or dramatic, but constant, a dull ache. The kind of silence that comes not from hatred, but from regret. Molly and Arthur welcomed Percy back. Ginny hugged him. Ron was awkward, but forgiving. But for George, now alone without his twin, the reunion was incomplete. There would be no jokes about ministry ties, no quips about cauldron bottoms, no brother waiting at the joke shop every morning. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, J.K. Rowling wrote, "Percy was shaking his brother and Ron was kneeling beside them, and Fred's eyes stared without seeing." The line is brutal in its simplicity. Percy, who had spent years separated from his family, had come back only to lose the chance to ever truly make things right with Fred. And Fred, for all his brilliance, never got to hear the apology in full. He never got to crack a sarcastic reply or smirk and say, "Took you long enough." That final joke, the final smile, it never came. Fred and George had countless opportunities. They could have met Percy halfway. They could have seen that behind the pompous speeches and endless ministry memos was a boy who just wanted to matter. A boy who admired Barty Crouch, not because he was blind, but because he wanted to become someone respected, someone important. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't just that Fred died, or that Percy lived with that guilt. It's that laughter, which had always united the Weasley family, became a weapon of distance, a way to avoid the pain of being serious, a mask for wounds that needed healing. In the end, Fred and George were masters of humour. But they weren't masters of heart, not when it mattered most. Their silence, their endless string of jests, kept Percy outside the circle. And by the time they opened that circle again, it was already too late. Fred's death wasn't just a tragedy of war, it was a tragedy of words unsaid, of jokes made in place of love, of chances missed and bridges burned under the fire of pride. And so Percy carried two weights into the post-war world, the shame of betrayal and the grief of never truly making amends. And George, left to run a shop built on laughter, lived with an echo that would never sound quite the same, because the real joke, the cruelest one of all, was that in the face of tragedy, Even the greatest pranksters ran out of words. Number 29. They ignored the importance of education. Fred and George Weasley were never truly interested in education. From the very first pages of their Hogwarts years, their behavior signaled a kind of rebellion, not against the system of magic itself, but against the structured and disciplined way it was taught. Professor McGonagall once warned them about their lack of seriousness, but her voice often faded into the background of their jokes. They thrived on chaos, and while their humor brought joy, it also brought a dangerous message. School doesn't matter. The twins weren't merely class clowns, they became icons of defiance, turning the solemn halls of Hogwarts into a stage for pranks. And beneath the laughter, many students stopped caring about grades, because if the Weasleys didn't, why should they? One could argue that Fred and George were simply expressing their creativity in a different form. Indeed, their skiving snack boxes, extendable ears, and Peruvian instant darkness powder were nothing short of genius. But that genius came wrapped in mockery of education. They didn't succeed despite their disregard for learning. They succeeded in part because they used Hogwarts as a testing ground while ignoring its lessons. As Hermione Granger once snapped, "Just because you've got the emotional range of a teaspoon doesn't mean we all have," a remark not aimed at them directly, but one that would have suited them perfectly when it came to their disinterest in deeper, structured magical knowledge. The trouble began early. In their third year, during Professor Snape's lessons on antidotes, Fred turned a classmate's potion into a mini smoke bomb. When Snape exploded with fury, the twins barely looked up from their doodled blueprints of joke shop items. Students laughed, Snape fumed, but no one remembered the actual content of the class. Fred and George had stolen the show, and with it, the chance for others to take learning seriously. The message was loud and clear: fun over facts. When the Triwizard Tournament came to Hogwarts in their 6th year, the twins decided they would force themselves into the competition, even though the goblet had an age line. Using an aging potion, they crossed the magical boundary, only to be hurled backward and grow beards for their trouble. It was a funny moment. Even Dumbledore chuckled, but beneath the laughter lay a troubling pattern. Instead of mastering magic through study, they continually attempted shortcuts, hacks, and tricks. Not once did they stop to think about the principles of such magic. Not once did they care. And their peers were watching. It is easy to celebrate them as underdog entrepreneurs who eventually opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Diagon Alley. But that's only half the truth. Their rise was paved not just with talent, but with a subtle form of sabotage. Every time they ridiculed a professor or turned a classroom into a circus, they sent a message. Authority is a joke, rules are made to be bent, and learning is optional. For someone like Neville Longbottom, already struggling with confidence, this behavior didn't help. It made it harder to admit he needed structure and support. He laughed when everyone else laughed, but it was the laughter of someone hiding behind the crowd. Even their departure from Hogwarts was a show of rebellion. During Dolores Umbridge's reign, Fred and George orchestrated a final spectacle: fireworks, swamp magic, and chaos before flying away on their brooms. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred shouted. And Peeves saluted. It was iconic. But what did it leave behind? A school in disarray, a headmistress without control, and a student body that had learned to cheer for anarchy instead of perseverance. In standing against tyranny, they forgot to leave anything constructive behind. Hermione, for all her know-it-all reputation, understood the stakes. She buried herself in textbooks not because she lacked imagination, but because she knew knowledge could be weaponized. In the Department of Mysteries, when spells were flying and lives were at stake, it was Hermione who remembered how to conjure protective charms and heal injuries. Fred and George, on the other hand, were notably absent. In that moment of reckoning, pranks had no place. Serious magic saved lives. Fred and George's influence reached beyond Gryffindor Tower. In the common room, first years looked at them like gods. Ron, their younger brother, often basked in their glow, even when it eclipsed his own development. "Wish I could just blow off exams like Fred and George," one student muttered in the library during OWL season. He didn't. But he dreamed about it. And dreams shape behavior. When education becomes the punchline of every joke, fewer students take it seriously. And in a world as dangerous as theirs, that's not just foolish, it's fatal. Consider Draco Malfoy. Arrogant and cruel as he often was, he at least understood that magical education had purpose. He mastered nonverbal spells, learned occlumency, and studied the dark arts with real ambition. His motives were twisted, but his respect for power was not. In contrast, Fred and George saw school as a springboard for jokes, and while their products were useful, sometimes even life-saving, they were not a replacement for comprehensive training. Just because their inventions worked didn't mean they fully understood the magic they were playing with. During the Battle of Hogwarts, the schools stood not just as a fortress, but as a symbol of learning under siege. Fred was there, fighting valiantly, but he died in the very place he had often treated like a joke. His death was tragic, not just because he was young, but because it forced everyone to confront what he had been, a prankster who never got the chance to grow up. His laughter echoed through the rubble, a haunting reminder of a boy who could have been so much more if he had taken things a little more seriously. There's a scene in the books where Molly Weasley says, "I don't care how much you've sold, you're not leaving school." But they left it anyway, and everyone cheered. It was presented as a triumph of independence, of passion over conformity. But in truth it was a surrender to the idea that formal education was unnecessary, that brilliance didn't need refinement, that natural talent excused ignorance. And Molly's heartbreak was the heartbreak of every parent who wants their child to rise without falling. Dumbledore, wise as he was, allowed too much freedom. He let the twins run wild, believing perhaps that joy was its own form of learning. But even Dumbledore should have drawn a line, because when students laugh more than they listen, the system begins to crack. When they admire mischief more than mastery, the future grows unstable. Fred and George may have made people smile, but they also made too many students think that school was optional. It was not. Hogwarts was not a stage. It was a sanctuary, a place where minds were shaped, powers understood, and futures forged. Transfiguration, potions, charms, defense against the dark arts. These were not just subjects, they were survival tools. And every time Fred and George turned a lesson into a joke, they blunted the blade of knowledge. What they gave in innovation, they took away in respect for the system that raised them. Luna Lovegood, often dismissed as eccentric, never mocked learning. She asked odd questions, yes, but she valued education. She listened, she grew. And when the moment came, she stood beside Harry and fought with knowledge and grace. Compare this to the early years of the twins, where everything was a game. They never evolved. They remained boys in men's roles, brilliant, funny, beloved, but never truly wise. The tragedy is not just in Fred's death, but in what he represented, a half-finished arc, a student who never became a scholar, a mind that sparkled but never deepened. He deserved better. George, left behind, perhaps realized that. His grief was more than personal. It was existential. Half of him died, but perhaps the part that survived understood, finally, that jokes alone could not sustain a soul. In the room of requirement, when Dumbledore's army trained in secret, the seriousness of education returned. Here, without teachers, students like Neville, Ginny, and even Seamus learned to respect magic as a craft. not as a source of entertainment, but as a shield and sword. Fred and George were never part of this. They were already gone, running a joke shop, selling wonders, but distant from the revolution.